want to get onto now is looking at some of the ways that ecosystems might adapt to climate change. And there are two main categories of adaptation I want to cover. The first is natural adaptation. These are autonomous responses by species and the ecosystems they form part of to climate changes that they experience. We know that this happens because ecosystems and species within them have persisted for millions of years of climate shifts, both warm and drier periods, and warm and wet periods, and cold and wet periods. So this suggests that in the pre-human era, at least, species and ecosystems did have some autonomous ability to adapt to climate variations. The three main mechanisms by which natural adaptation occurs are firstly through changes in the physiology and the phenology, the physical form and the behavior of species within the range that's permitted by their current set of genes and the variation of those genes within the population. So, for instance, there's evidence that, at least from Europe, that those European birds who migrate that have adjusted their arrival time, and that's over a few years as climate has been changing, have exhibited increasing populations. So that adaptation has actually enabled the populations to grow. Whereas those that have not had the capacity to autonomously shift their arrival times have declining populations. So that autonomous adaptation hasn't happened and they have been more at risk to climate change. Now, one of the problems with this is that these are all individual responses with individual species. So we're uncertain about how these different species level shifts would interact at the ecosystem level. So it might work for small changes in climate, but if, for instance, with these birds, other factors that are important for their population dynamics don't change at the same time, then those individualistic or species-specific changes may get out of sync with the broader ecosystem changes. The second way that species can change autonomously is through changes actually in the genetics. So this is where the genetic makeup changes to change the characteristics and traits that make them better suited for the new environmental conditions within which they're located. And we can either get fast genetic changes, and this happens through a couple of different mechanisms. The first, which is just selection of existing genes. So we have lots of genes and gene types within species. Some of them are not actually used at the moment. So as conditions change, some genes may be selected that actually bring a particular behavior that is more suited to the new climate. The second is through epigenetics. So this is still a very new area, but this is the idea that stresses that are induced in one generation of a species produce small changes in the selection and the makeup of the genes, and that these can then be inherited by future generations. These fast mechanisms are very useful because those changes can happen in a few generations. So they can generally, if they produce the right changes in behavior or in tolerances, then they can probably happen at a speed that works for the expected rates of change of climate change. The slower changes are through the sort of more familiar process of evolution, so Darwin's evolution, which is through mutation of genes. So random mutations in genes change the genetic makeup of animals, and then if there are mutations that actually make them more suitable to the changing climatic conditions, those will be the species that outcompete other members of that species group. Now, these are very slow and are essentially random, so those are much less likely to be able to cope with the rates of change that we are expecting over the next 100 or 200 years. Now, there's been some modeling work, mostly working with models, sort of theoretical models, to look at whether these kind of autonomous genetic adaptations could actually cope with expected climate change. The general rule is that animals and plants with faster breeding cycles can respond faster. So for larger animals, they have longer lifetimes, so the rate of genetic turnover is much slower. But a possible benefit for larger animals is that they're much more prone to actually having almost like cultural practices. So if you think of a herd of elephants, the young elephants actually learn a lot from the older elephants, and so if if individual elephants in that population can develop new behaviors that make them more resilient to a particular environmental change, that can actually be passed down from generation to generation by learning rather than genetics. So some of the studies that have tried to model the rates of these changes show that for slow breeding species, for instance, large trees, which have a lifetime of maybe 50 or 100 years, the rates of autonomous adaptation are just not fast enough to cope with the expected rates of climate change. For some birds, for instance, in Africa, say a small seed-eating bird who breed once or twice a season and have quite short lifetimes, the rates of change can roughly keep up with the slowest projected rates of climate change. So if we have low rates of climate change kind of at the low end of the spectrum, then they may be able to adapt genetically. And then for very fast breeding cycles, so something like insects, which have multiple sort of generations a year, they can actually potentially adapt at rates that can cope with even the fastest rates of climate change. So then this sort of leads us to this fact that different species within these ecosystems will be potentially evolving at different rates, and we don't quite know what the outcome of that would mean in terms of the overall ecosystem structure. The third main way that autonomous adaptation can occur is something we've talked about quite a lot already when we looked at vulnerability to climate change, and that's essentially just migration, so shifts in the ranges of species. And as we've discussed that quite a lot previously, I'm not going to go into it in any more detail now. But it's worth noting that in pre-human times, so when we had fluctuations in climate, say from ice age to a warm period, this migration process seemed to be the major mechanisms by which adaptation occurred, rather than through these autonomous genetic changes that I've talked about previously.